Sarah, a young, vibrant woman with a spirit as bright as the summer sun, had finally achieved her dream, homeownership. After years of diligent saving and careful budgeting, she purchased a charming albeit slightly run-down bungalow in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house wasn't perfect, but it was hers, a symbol of her hard work and independence. And the best part? It came with a small, neglected pool in the backyard, a blank canvas for relaxation and fun. After weeks of cleaning, repairing, and prepping, the pool was finally ready. The crystal-clear water shimmered under the warm afternoon sun, beckoning Sarah to unwind after a particularly grueling week at her demanding job as a graphic designer. She slipped into her favorite swimsuit, a vibrant turquoise that mirrored the sparkling water, and grabbed a thick, fluffy towel. With a sigh of contentment, she stepped out into her backyard, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the chlorine from the pool. This was her sanctuary, her escape from the pressures of daily life. Sarah stretched out on a comfortable lounge chair, the sun warming her skin. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle breeze rustle through the leaves of the nearby oak tree. For a few blissful moments she was at peace. But her tranquility was shattered by the sudden appearance of a shadow looming over her. She opened her eyes to find Mrs. Higgins, her next-door neighbor, standing at the fence, her face etched with disapproval. Mrs. Higgins was a woman of a certain age, known for her tightly controlled demeanor and her penchant for gossip. She was the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards, and she took her role very seriously. "Excuse me," Mrs. Higgins began, her voice sharp and laced with suspicion. Are you supposed to be here?" Sarah, startled by the abrupt interruption, sat up and adjusted her sunglasses. "Yes, I live here," she replied, a hint of confusion in her voice. "I bought the house a few months ago." Mrs. Higgins's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Sarah from head to toe. "I haven't seen you around much," she said, her tone implying that this was somehow Sarah's fault. "And frankly," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "you don't look like the type who could afford this place." Sarah felt a surge of indignation rise within her. How dare this woman judge her based on her appearance? She had worked tirelessly to buy this house, and she wasn't going to be questioned by her nosy neighbor. "I assure you, Mrs. Higgins," Sarah said, her voice firm but polite, "I own this house. I have the paperwork to prove it." Mrs. Higgins remained unconvinced. She crossed her arms over her chest, her expression hardening. "Well," she huffed, "I'm going to have to call the authorities. I suspect you're trespassing." She paused, her eyes raking over Sarah again, taking in her swimsuit, her relaxed posture, the simple fact that she was enjoying the sun. "And frankly," she added, her voice dripping with condescension, "you look homeless." The word hung in the air, heavy with judgment and prejudice. Sarah was stunned. Homeless? Just because she was sunbathing in her own backyard? The absurdity of the accusation was almost comical, but the underlying malice was clear. Mrs. Higgins had made a snap judgment based on her preconceived notions, and she was now ready to call the police based on nothing but her own biased assumptions. Sarah tried to reason with Mrs. Higgins, explaining that she had the documents to prove ownership, that she had just moved in a few months prior, and that she was simply enjoying her new pool. But Mrs. Higgins was impervious to reason. Her mind was made up. She had already labeled Sarah, and nothing Sarah could say would change her perception. "I've seen enough," Mrs. Higgins declared, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." She turned her back on Sarah, her posture radiating self-righteousness. Sarah watched, a mix of anger and disbelief churning inside her. This was her property, her home, her sanctuary. And she was being accused of being homeless, of trespassing, simply for daring to relax in her own backyard. As Mrs. Higgins dialed 911, Sarah, realizing the potential for the situation to escalate, decided to document the interaction. She pulled out her own phone and began recording. She knew that having a record of what was happening could be crucial later on. Mrs. Higgins, oblivious to Sarah's recording, spoke to the 911 operator, her voice filled with dramatic urgency. "Yes, officer, I have a suspicious individual on my property," she said. "She's by the pool. She claims to live here, but I highly doubt it. She looks like she's living on the streets." The words, spoken with such conviction, stung Sarah, even though they were completely unfounded. She could hear the operator asking questions and Mrs. Higgins embellishing the story, painting Sarah as a vagrant, a threat to the neighborhood. Sarah felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a criminal. She tried to remain calm, to maintain her composure, but her heart was racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had just wanted to relax and enjoy her new home, but now she was facing a humiliating confrontation with her neighbor, all because of a prejudiced assumption. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers approaching the fence with caution. Mrs. Higgins, her face flushed with excitement, pointed at Sarah. "That's her," she exclaimed, her voice ringing with accusation. "The homeless woman?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She knew she had to stay calm and explain the situation clearly. This was her home, and she wasn't going to be intimidated by her judgmental neighbor. The officers approached Sarah, their expressions neutral, assessing the scene. One of them asked, "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a moment?" Sarah nodded, bracing herself for what was to come. She knew this was just the beginning of a long and frustrating ordeal. The sun, which had been so welcoming just moments ago, now seemed to cast a harsh light on the absurd situation. The tranquility of the afternoon had been shattered, replaced by the tension of an unjust accusation. The police officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davis, approached Sarah cautiously, their eyes scanning the scene. Mrs. Higgins, still buzzing with self-importance, hovered nearby, eager to witness Sarah's supposed comeuppance. Officer Miller, a seasoned officer with a calm demeanor, addressed Sarah. "Ma'am," he began, "we received a call about a possible trespasser. Can you explain what's going on?" Sarah, despite her inner turmoil, maintained her composure. She knew that panicking or getting angry would only make the situation worse. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, "I live here. This is my property." She gestured towards the house. "I bought it a few months ago." Officer Davis, younger and more impressionable, glanced at Mrs. Higgins, who nodded vigorously, her expression conveying her unwavering belief in Sarah's guilt. Officer Miller, however, remained neutral. "Do you have any proof of ownership, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes, I do," Sarah replied. "I have the deed and other relevant documents inside the house." She hesitated, then added, "I was just relaxing by the pool when Mrs. Higgins started accusing me of trespassing and called the police." Officer Miller turned to Mrs. Higgins. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have any evidence to suggest that this woman doesn't live here?" Mrs. Higgins sputtered, her face reddening. "Well, I haven't seen her around much," she stammered. "And she just doesn't look like she belongs here." Officer Miller raised an eyebrow. "And what do you mean by that, ma'am?" Mrs. Higgins, realizing she was treading on thin ice, backtracked slightly. I just thought it was suspicious," she mumbled. "She was just sunbathing." Officer Miller sighed inwardly. He had dealt with these kinds of neighborhood disputes before, and they were always a headache. He glanced back at Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, "would you mind getting the proof of ownership? We just need to verify your claim." "Of course," Sarah replied. She walked towards the back door of her house, feeling a mixture of frustration and relief. She was confident that the documents would clear everything up, but she also knew that this whole situation was unnecessarily humiliating. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at Mrs. Higgins, who was still glaring at her with undisguised animosity. Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let this woman's prejudice ruin her day. Inside the house, Sarah retrieved the necessary documents: the deed to the property, her homeowner's insurance policy, and a recent utility bill with her name and address. She carefully organized them and returned to the backyard, where the officers and Mrs. Higgins were waiting. She handed the documents to Officer Miller, who examined them carefully. He compared the name on the deed to Sarah's driver's license, which she also provided. Everything checked out. Officer Miller looked at Officer Davis and gave a subtle nod. "Everything seems to be in order, ma'am," he said to Sarah. "These documents confirm that you are the owner of this property." Mrs. Higgins, her face now a mask of disbelief and embarrassment, sputtered again. But I don't understand," she stammered. Officer Miller turned to Mrs. Higgins, his voice now firm. "Ma'am," he said, "it appears that you made a false accusation. This woman is the legal owner of this property, and she has every right to be here." Mrs. Higgins, realizing the implications of her actions, began to apologize. I'm so sorry," she said to Sarah. "I didn't mean. I made a mistake." Sarah, though still angry, decided to take the high road. She knew that Mrs. Higgins's apology was likely motivated by fear of legal repercussions rather than genuine remorse, but she didn't want to escalate the situation further. "It's all right, Mrs. Higgins," she said, her voice measured. "Just please don't make assumptions like that again." Officer Miller, satisfied that the situation had been resolved, turned to Sarah. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for the inconvenience. We had to follow up on the call, but it's clear that there's been a misunderstanding." "Thank you, officer," Sarah replied. As the police officers left, Mrs. Higgins remained, looking deflated and ashamed. She avoided Sarah's gaze and retreated back to her own yard, the gate slamming shut behind her. Sarah watched her go, a sense of weariness settling over her. She had proven her ownership, but the incident had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She couldn't believe that her neighbor had judged her so quickly, simply based on her appearance. The word homeless echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the prejudice she had faced. She looked around her backyard, her little slice of paradise. The sun was still shining, the pool still sparkling, but the tranquility of the afternoon had been irrevocably shattered. She knew that she would never look at her neighbor or her neighborhood in the same way again. The incident had exposed a dark undercurrent of judgment and prejudice that she hadn't realized existed. It was a stark reminder that even in seemingly peaceful suburban communities, assumptions and biases could lead to hurtful accusations and unnecessary confrontations. The sense of security she had felt in her new home had been shaken, replaced by a lingering unease. She wondered if this was just the beginning of a long and uncomfortable relationship with her neighbor, or if they could somehow find a way to coexist peacefully. The thought of future interactions with Mrs. Higgins filled her with dread. She hoped that Mrs. Higgins had learned her lesson, but she wasn't optimistic. The damage had been done, and Sarah knew that the memory of this incident would linger for a long time. The days following the incident were awkward. Sarah tried to avoid Mrs. Higgins, but their houses were too close for complete isolation. Every time Sarah ventured into her backyard, she felt Mrs. Higgins's eyes on her, even if the woman wasn't physically present. The silence between their houses was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah found it difficult to relax by the pool, the memory of Mrs. Higgins's accusations lingering like a dark cloud. She felt a sense of violation, as if her privacy had been invaded, her character unfairly judged. One evening, Sarah was tending to her small flower garden near the fence when she heard a hesitant voice. "Sarah?" She looked up to see Mrs. Higgins standing on the other side, her shoulders slumped, her face etched with regret. Sarah straightened up, unsure of what to expect. "Sarah," Mrs. Higgins began, her voice trembling slightly, I wanted to apologize again. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I truly am ashamed of my behavior." Sarah remained silent, listening. "I acted terribly," Mrs. Higgins continued. "I made assumptions based on nothing. I judged you without knowing you, and I was completely wrong. What I said was hurtful and unfair, and I deeply regret it." Sarah studied Mrs. Higgins's face. She saw genuine remorse in her eyes, not just embarrassment or fear of repercussions. She saw a woman who had been forced to confront her own prejudices, a woman who seemed genuinely contrite. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day," Mrs. Higgins said. "I realized that I wasn't just wrong about you, Sarah. I was wrong about a lot of things. I've let my biases cloud my judgment for too long, and it's not right. It's not fair to anyone." Sarah was surprised by Mrs. Higgins's honesty. She had expected a perfunctory apology, not this heartfelt confession. She began to understand that Mrs. Higgins's behavior wasn't just about her. It was about Mrs. Higgins's own internal struggles, her own insecurities and prejudices. "I know it will take time for you to forgive me," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I hope that one day you can. I truly want to make amends." Sarah was touched by Mrs. Higgins's sincerity. She knew that forgiveness wasn't easy, but she also believed in second chances. She had been judged unfairly, and she knew how much it hurt. She didn't want to perpetuate that cycle of judgment. "Mrs. Higgins," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm, "I appreciate your apology. What you said was hurtful, and it did affect me. But I can see that you're genuinely sorry, and I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." Mrs. Higgins's eyes welled up with tears. "Thank you, Sarah," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for your kindness." Sarah smiled. "It's okay, Mrs. Higgins. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." A comfortable silence fell between them. The tension that had hung in the air for days began to dissipate. "You know," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "I'm having a small barbecue this weekend. I'd love for you to come. It would be a chance for us to get to know each other better without any misunderstandings." Mrs. Higgins's face lit up. "I'd love that, Sarah," she said. "Thank you for inviting me." The barbecue was a success. Sarah and Mrs. Higgins talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their families, their hopes and dreams. Sarah learned that Mrs. Higgins had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, that she had raised her children there, and that she had recently lost her husband. She understood now that Mrs. Higgins's initial hostility had stemmed from a place of loneliness and fear, a fear of change and outsiders. Mrs. Higgins, in turn, learned about Sarah's passion for design, her love of travel, and her dream of starting her own business. She realized that Sarah was a kind, intelligent, and compassionate person, not the homeless stereotype she had conjured in her mind. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Higgins approached Sarah. "Sarah," she said, "I want to thank you again for your kindness and your understanding. I know I don't deserve it, but I truly appreciate it." Sarah smiled. "You're welcome, Mrs. Higgins. I'm glad we had this chance to talk. I think we can be good neighbors." Mrs. Higgins nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "I think so too, Sarah. I think so too." From that day forward, Sarah and Mrs. Higgins's relationship changed. They were no longer just neighbors, they were friends. They would often chat over the fence, sharing gardening tips or discussing local news. Sarah even helped Mrs. Higgins with some design ideas for her garden, and Mrs. Higgins in turn shared her knowledge of the neighborhood with Sarah. Sarah finally felt at home in her new house. The shadow of the earlier incident had faded, replaced by a sense of belonging and community. She had learned that even in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding, kindness and forgiveness could prevail. And she had found a friend in the most unexpected place. The sun, which had once seemed to cast a harsh light on the absurd situation, now shone warmly on a budding friendship, a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of new beginnings. The pool, once a source of anxiety, became a place of relaxation and joy, a symbol of Sarah's resilience and her ability to find peace and happiness in her own backyard. And as she floated in the cool water, she knew that she had not only found a home, but she had also found a community and a friend. Have you ever made a snap judgment about someone based on appearances? Let Sarah and Mrs. Higgins's story be a reminder to us all to look beyond the surface and give people a chance. Share your thoughts in the comments below.